Hannah Brooks had buried a husband, sold everything she owned, and ridden 3 days on a stagecoach with nothing but a worn carpet bag and a letter that promised a fresh start. The moment she stepped down onto the dirt road in Cutter's Creek, a small boy pointed at her from the porch and asked loud enough for the whole street to hear, "Is she the one who's supposed to replace our mother?" Before Hannah could draw a single breath, a teenage girl stepped forward, looked her dead in the eye, and said, "She won't last a week." If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and follow Hannah all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. The letter had been short, practical, almost cold. Seeking a woman of sound character and capable hands. Widowed preferred. Must cook, manage a household, and tolerate noise. 5 children, ages 4 to 15. Ranch outside Cutter's Creek, Wyoming. Room board and fair wages provided. Respond to Samuel Carter Box 7. Hannah had read it 4 times at the kitchen table of the boarding house, where she'd been sleeping on a cot for 3 weeks. Her savings down to coins, her options down to almost nothing. She wasn't looking for love. She wasn't looking for adventure. She was looking for a door that would open because every other door in her life had closed. She wrote back the same afternoon. The stagecoach rolled into Cutter's Creek on a Tuesday just past noon, and the summer heat was the kind that pressed down on a person like a hand on the back of the neck. Hannah climbed down with her carpet bag and stood on the main street, squinting against the sun, trying to find the face she'd been told to look for. She found 5 of them instead. They were lined up along the porch railing of the general store across the street. 5 children, tallest to smallest, all of them, watching her with expressions that ranged from open suspicion to something that looked very close to hatred. The oldest was a girl, maybe 15, dark-haired and straight-backed, with eyes that didn't blink. Beside her stood a boy, a few years younger, arms crossed, jaw set. Then a smaller boy who stared without expression. Then a little girl with red-rimmed eyes. And at the end of the line, barely tall enough to see over the railing, a small boy in a dusty shirt pointed one finger directly at Hannah and asked in a voice that carried clear across the street, "Is she the one who's supposed to replace our mother?" Hannah opened her mouth. The oldest girl beat her to it. "She's not replacing anyone." Emily Carter said, her voice flat and certain as a door slamming shut. "She's just another mistake Dad paid for." A woman standing nearby with a basket on her arm let out a short, sharp laugh. 2 men on the steps of the barber shop exchanged a look. Nobody said a word in Hannah's defense. Nobody stepped forward. The street just absorbed the moment the way dry ground absorbs water quickly, completely, without a trace. Hannah closed her mouth. She picked up her bag. She crossed the street. Samuel Carter was not at the store. A man named Walt, who ran the livery stable, told Hannah that Samuel was at the ranch and that he'd sent the wagon for her. But the wagon had thrown a wheel on the east road, so someone would come for her shortly, and in the meantime, she was welcome to wait. He said this without quite meeting her eyes. Hannah waited on a bench outside the store for 40 minutes. The children had disappeared back inside. People passed and glanced at her and looked away. One older woman paused, studied Hannah from hat to boot, and then moved on without a word. When the wagon finally arrived, it was driven not by Samuel Carter, but by Emily, who sat up on the bench with the reins in her hands and her chin pointed at the sky, managing to communicate through posture alone that she had not volunteered for this task and was doing it purely out of some obligation she deeply resented. Hannah climbed up. She set her bag between her feet. She said, "Thank you for coming." Emily said nothing. They rode in silence for the better part of 3 miles. The land on either side was wide and sun-bleached grass, moving slow in the hot wind. Hannah watched it and thought about the last time she'd ridden next to someone in a wagon. Thomas, her husband, talking the whole way to market, making her laugh at things that weren't even that funny, just because she could never quite resist the way he told a story. Thomas had been dead for 14 months. She stopped that thought where it was and pressed it down. "How long have you been managing the household?" Hannah asked. Emily's hands tightened on the reins. "Since my mother died." "That's a lot for someone your age." I'm not someone. I'm Emily Carter. This is my family's ranch, and I don't need help. Your father seems to think otherwise. My father, Emily said carefully, like she was choosing each word the way you'd choose footing on a wet rock, makes decisions that aren't always right. This is one of them. Hannah looked at the road ahead. Maybe. Time will tell. Time will tell that you'll be gone before the first frost. Emily flicked the reins. They always are. Hannah turned to look at her. How many have there been? A pause. Then grudgingly, you're the third. What happened to the others? The first one cried for 2 days straight and took the stage back to Cheyenne. The second one lasted 11 days. Luke put a frog in her bed on day 6 and she threatened to call the sheriff. A beat. She didn't last 5 more days after that. Hannah absorbed this information. I see. Do you... I'm not afraid of frogs, Hannah said. Emily looked at her for the first time since they'd started writing. Her expression didn't soften, but something in it shifted a tiny recalibration, the way a scale adjusts when the weight on it is slightly different than expected. She looked back at the road and said nothing else. Samuel Carter was splitting wood behind the barn when they arrived. He stopped when he heard the wagon. He set the axe down and walked around the side of the barn, and Hannah got her first real look at the man who had written that short, practical letter. He was tall and lean and weathered in the way of men who spend most of their lives outdoors, with a face that might have been handsome once, and still was in a quiet, unfinished way, like a sentence that never quite got to the period. He wore no hat, which surprised her. His hair was dark and needed cutting. There were lines around his eyes that had nothing to do with squinting. He looked at Hannah the way you look at a problem you've already tried to solve twice before and aren't sure you want to try a third time. Miss Brooks, he said. Mr. Carter. He nodded at her bag. Walt'll show you the room. He picked up the axe again. Supper's expected at 6. That was it. That was the full extent of their first introduction. He turned back to the woodpile, and she stood in the dust with her carpet bag and the sun pressing down on the back of her neck, and she thought, this is what I said yes to. She told herself it would be enough. The room was small and plain and clean. A narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a window that looked out over the back pasture. Hannah unpacked her few things, 2 extra dresses, a pair of books, a framed photograph of Thomas that she put face down in the drawer, and then went to find the kitchen. The kitchen was large and well-stocked and deeply aggressively disordered. Pots in the wrong places, flour on the wrong shelf. Something unidentifiable dried on the bottom of the largest pan. Hannah stood in the doorway and took a quiet inventory. She found an apron on a peg by the door, tied it on, and started. She had biscuits in the oven and a pot of stew on the fire by 5 o'clock. She'd found beans and salt pork and dried herbs she had to search for, tucked behind 2 misplaced sacks of cornmeal. She'd scrubbed the pan. She'd reorganized the flour shelf. She'd done all of it without saying a word to anyone because there was no one to say anything till the kitchen had been empty, and she'd preferred it that way. At 10 minutes to 6, Daisy appeared in the doorway. She was 7 years old and had the kind of face that made it obvious she'd been crying recently, the slight puffiness around the eyes, the careful stillness that comes after you've worked hard to stop. She stood in the doorway and looked at Hannah with enormous brown eyes, and then at the stove, and then back at Hannah. That smells like Mama's stew, she said. Hannah turned from the fire. Does it? Almost. Daisy took a small step into the kitchen. Mama used more pepper. I can add more pepper. It's okay. Daisy came a little closer and looked into the pot. She used to let me stir. Hannah handed her the spoon without a word. Daisy stirred. Her chin trembled slightly. She stirred again and then handed the spoon back and walked out of the kitchen without looking at Hannah. But she came back at 6 for supper. She sat at the far end of the table, but she came. Luke did not come to supper. Samuel said nothing about this. He sat at the head of the table and ate without looking at Hannah, responding to Noah's occasional quiet questions about the east fence, with brief, factual answers. Ben sat beside Samuel and ate with his hands, despite the fork beside his plate, which nobody corrected. Emily ate precisely and spoke to no one. Noah observed everything. Daisy stared at her bowl. Hannah sat and ate, and kept her mouth shut, and listened, cataloging what she could. The family spoke around silences, the way water moves around rocks. They'd learned the shape of their grief, and they'd learned to navigate it, but they hadn't learned to name it. That much was clear. After supper, when she was washing up, she heard footsteps behind her and turned. Luke was standing at the back door, studying her with the specific, evaluating gaze of a 13-year-old who has decided in advance that he will not be impressed. "You left the stew pot on too long," he said. "It'll burn to the bottom." "It didn't burn," Hannah said, turning back to the washing. "It was about to." "But it didn't." She handed him a dried dish. "Here, you can put this away if you know where it goes." He looked at the dish like she'd handed him something suspicious. Then he took it, opened the correct cabinet without hesitation, and put it away. "Mama kept the bowls on the left," he said. "You moved them to the right." "I put them where it made sense to me. If it causes a real problem, I'll move them back." "It causes a problem, Luke." She faced him. "I'm not trying to rearrange your mother's kitchen. I'm trying to be able to cook without searching for 20 minutes before I start. If you tell me where things belong, I'll put them there." He stared at her. He was trying to find the manipulation in what she'd just said. She could see him looking for it, the way you check a gift for hidden strings. "The big pot goes on the left hook," he said finally, "not the right." "Noted." She moved the pot. "Thank you." He left without saying anything else. But the back door closed quietly instead of slamming. Hannah counted that. She found her carpet bag on the porch the next morning, contents scattered. Not everything, just enough. Her second-best dress pulled halfway out. One of her books with the spine bent back. Nothing destroyed, everything touched. A message without words. "You don't belong here. Nothing of yours is safe." She stood on the porch and looked at it for a moment. The morning was already warm, the sun coming in low and flat over the top of the east pasture. Birds somewhere she couldn't see. She gathered her things, went inside, and started breakfast. Samuel came into the kitchen while she was making eggs. He poured coffee and stood by the window and drank it without speaking. After a while, he said without turning around, "I'll have a word with Luke." "It's not necessary," Hannah said. He turned then. His expression was complicated in a way that was hard to read, something between guilt and relief, with a thin layer of something else underneath. "He had no right to." "He had every right, Mr. Carter. As far as he's concerned, I'm a stranger in his home. I'd rather earn his trust than get it ordered into him." She set a plate of eggs on the table. "That's not something you can make happen. You know that." Samuel looked at the plate. He looked at her. He said, "The last woman who tried said trust building took time she didn't have." "I have time," Hannah said. "I'm not going anywhere." He studied her the way he'd studied her the day before, like a problem he wasn't certain how to approach. Then he pulled out the chair and sat down and picked up his fork. "Breakfast is hot," he said, which Hannah was coming to understand might be the closest Samuel Carter got to thank you. Margaret Doyle arrived that afternoon. She came in a buggy with a neighbor woman riding beside her as company, which Hannah recognized immediately for what it was, a witness. Margaret was 45, well-dressed for a summer weekday in Cutter's Creek, with the kind of smile that had been trained to disarm and hadn't entirely forgotten its original purpose. She knocked on the doorframe and walked in before anyone answered. "I heard Samuel had finally hired on some help," she said, looking at Hannah with an expression of warm surgical appraisal. "I wanted to be neighborly and introduce myself. Margaret Doyle. My late husband ran the supply store in town. I manage it now." "Hannah Brooks," Hannah said. "Can I offer you coffee, Mrs. Doyle? I won't stay long." Margaret set a covered dish on the kitchen table. "I brought a pie, apple, Samuel's favorite. She said this the way you plant a flag. I've been making sure this family had proper meals at least twice a week since Clara passed. It would be a shame to let that lapse now that someone's new to the arrangement. The arrangement, Hannah repeated. The household. Margaret smiled. We're a close-knit town, Miss Brooks. We look after our own. A pause precisely timed. You'll find the families here can be very welcoming once they know you're someone worth welcoming. She left the pie and took her neighbor and went the buggy wheels, raising a thin curl of dust on the road back toward town. Hannah stood in the kitchen and looked at the pie for a long moment. Then she moved it to the far end of the counter and went back to work. But work. By the end of the first week, she knew the shape of the days. Samuel rose before dawn and was gone to the fields before breakfast. Emily managed the younger children, like a general managing a campaign efficiently, without warmth, out of deep loyalty, rather than pleasure. Luke disappeared after morning chores, and came back at supper time sunburned and silent. Noah sat under the big oak most afternoons with a book. Daisy followed Hannah at a cautious distance, like a small animal deciding whether to trust the new hand that held the food. Ben was the easiest and the hardest. He was 4 years old and had almost no memory of his mother, which meant he had no particular resistance to Hannah, but it also meant that every small moment of ordinary comfort he accepted from her felt loaded with a weight she hadn't expected. When he fell asleep against her arm on the porch swing one evening, she sat very still and looked at the sky and didn't let herself feel what she felt, because feeling it would have made it mean something, and it was too early for that. She was still a stranger in this house. She needed to remember that. On the 8th day, she went into town for supplies. She heard it at the dry goods store, 2 women talking in the next aisle over just loud enough to make sure she'd hear. Margaret says she's the 3rd one he's brought in, never stays long. Well, what does he expect with those children? Emily alone would run off the Queen of England. Margaret says she's probably after the land. Heard she was near destitute when she answered the ad. Most of them are. Hannah turned the corner with her basket. The women looked at her. One of them had the grace to look uncomfortable. The other held her ground and looked right back the way people do when they've decided the thing they said wasn't wrong. Hannah bought her flour and her salt and her dry beans. She said good morning to the shopkeeper, who answered her with a short nod. She walked back to the wagon. She was loading the bags when she heard Margaret Doyle's voice from the boardwalk across the street, carrying as clearly as a bell on a still morning. Honestly, I give her until August. These women from the East come out here thinking a pretty face is a plan. It never lasts. Hannah set the last bag in the wagon bed. She climbed up to the bench. She picked up the reins. She did not look across the street. She clicked her tongue and the horse moved forward, and she held the reins steady all the way back to the ranch with her hands not quite shaking and her jaw set, and something hard and quiet settling in her chest, like a stone finding the bottom of a river. She had been called worse things than a mistake. She had survived worse things than someone's estimate of her. She wasn't going anywhere. Not until she'd earned the right to decide to leave on her own terms. And she hadn't earned that yet. So she drove the wagon home, and she unloaded the supplies, and she started dinner. And the summer pressed on. The summer heat didn't break. It settled in like an unwanted guest who'd decided to stay, pressing down on the Carter Ranch from sunrise to past dark, baking the yard dust to powder, and turning the air inside the house thick and still. Hannah had been there 11 days. She knew because she'd been counting not out of misery, but out of something more like determination. 11 days was longer than the second woman had lasted. She wasn't keeping score. She just needed the number. She was up before the children every morning. That was intentional. The kitchen was the only room in the house where nobody questioned her presence outright, and the hour before anyone else appeared was the 1 hour she could move through without someone's resistance pressing against her like a wall. She learned the stove's moods, how the left burner ran hot, how the damper needed coaxing on damp mornings, how the big cast iron skillet had a handle that turned unexpectedly if you weren't paying attention. She learned these things the way she'd learned everything since Thomas died alone quietly by doing. On the 12th morning, Ben came downstairs before anyone else. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt with his hair going in 4 directions, looked at Hannah at the stove, and said with the complete authority of a 4-year-old who has recently acquired an opinion, "I don't like eggs." "Good morning to you too," Hannah said. "I don't like eggs," he repeated in case she'd missed it. "What do you like?" He thought about this seriously, one finger pressed to his lower lip. "Corn cake." "We don't have the right cornmeal for corn cake today," Hannah said. "But I can make you something better than eggs. Do you like oats?" He looked suspicious. "What kind?" "The kind with brown sugar and a little butter." A pause. "How much butter?" "Enough," Hannah said. He climbed onto the bench at the kitchen table and watched her with the focused, evaluating attention of a very small person deciding whether or not he was being taken advantage of. When she set the bowl in front of him, he looked at it for a long moment. Then he picked up his spoon. He didn't say it was good. He ate the whole bowl and then sat there looking at the empty bottom, and then he looked up at Hannah and said, "Can I have more?" She gave him more. Neither of them said anything else. But when Emily came downstairs 20 minutes later and found Ben in the kitchen still eating while Hannah washed the pan, something moved across Emily's face, something quick and involuntary gone before it fully formed. Like she'd seen something she hadn't expected to see and wasn't ready to decide what to do with it. "He doesn't usually eat breakfast," Emily said flatly. "He does today," Hannah said. Emily poured her coffee and left. Hannah kept washing. Luke came at her sideways. That was his method, never a direct confrontation, nothing she could name and address plainly. Just the constant low-grade erosion of small hostile acts, each one deniable on its own. Her good scissors disappeared from the sewing basket and turned up 3 days later in the barn. A pot she'd left soaking overnight was moved outside and left in the yard. One afternoon, she went to collect eggs and found the chicken coop latched in a way she hadn't latched it, meaning she had to go back to the house for the right tool, meaning the eggs she'd gathered were delayed, meaning supper was late by 20 minutes. Samuel said nothing about any of it. He noticed she was fairly sure he noticed, but he also hadn't made her a promise of anything except room board and wages, and smoothing over his son's resentments wasn't in the original arrangement. Hannah adapted. She moved her scissors to a different location. She checked the coop latch before she needed it. She started keeping a running mental inventory of everything that could be moved or hidden, not out of anger, but out of pragmatism. She had grown up with 3 brothers. She understood the grammar of small acts of war. What she hadn't quite prepared for was the day she came around the corner of the house and found Luke sitting on the back steps with his head in his hands. She almost kept walking. It would have been easier. Instead, she stopped. "You eat lunch?" she asked. He didn't look up. "I'm not hungry." "That's not what I asked." He was quiet for a moment, then roughly, "No." She went inside and came back out with bread and cold sliced beef and a cup of water and set it on the step beside him. She didn't sit down. She didn't say anything. She just left it there and went back to what she'd been doing. 20 minutes later, the plate was empty, and Luke was gone. She washed the plate and added it to her private count of things that were not nothing. It was Margaret who escalated first. She came back on a Thursday this time without the neighbor woman, which was a different kind of statement. She'd moved past needing a witness and into something more direct. She found Hannah in the vegetable garden and stood on the other side of the fence and said pleasantly enough, "I've been talking to a few folks in town. There's some concern about the children." Hannah looked up from the row she was working. "Is there?" "People who've known this family for years, Miss Brooks. People who care about Samuel and those kids. They're wondering if this arrangement is really appropriate, given that nobody knows much about you." Margaret tilted her head. "You understand, I'm sure. A widow alone arriving with not much to recommend her, but a letter she wrote herself." "I'd think carefully about where this conversation goes," Hannah said. Her voice was completely even. She was still kneeling in the dirt. Margaret blinked. She hadn't expected that. "I'm not finished," she started. "Yes, you are," Hannah said. "Not angry, just certain. You came here to see if I could be rattled. You found out I can't. So we can be done here." Margaret's pleasant expression flickered like a candle in a draft. Something harder surfaced underneath, and then she put the pleasant expression back over it, and she said very quietly, "You have no idea how this town works, Miss Brooks." "I know how people work," Hannah said. She went back to her weeding. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Doyle." She heard the buggy leave. She knelt in the dirt and pulled weeds for a long time after it was gone longer than she needed to, because she needed her hands to be doing something, while the tightness in her chest worked its way back down to manageable. She'd handled it. She'd held her ground. But Margaret Doyle had not looked like a woman who was finished. The first crack in Emily happened on a Sunday afternoon quietly and without warning, the way important things often do. Hannah was at the table working on mending a shirt of Noah's that had torn at the shoulder, which she'd been putting off when Emily came in, and sat down across from her. Not because she'd been invited. Not because she had anything particular to say. She sat down the way someone sits down when they're tired of standing and there's nowhere else to go. After a long silence, Emily said, "My mother made Sunday the mending day." Hannah kept her needle moving. Practical choice. Quieter on Sundays. She said it was the one day nobody needed anything fixed fast. Another pause. Everything else was always fast. Cows don't wait, she said. Weather doesn't wait. But a torn shirt can wait until Sunday. She sounds like she was organized, Hannah said. She was better than organized. Emily's voice was careful and brittle, and absolutely not going to break. She was good at everything. She never got flustered. When the Hendersons' barn burned, she had food there before anyone else was even dressed. When Ben had the croup as a baby, she was up 3 nights in a row without... She stopped. She looked at her hands flat on the table. "Sorry, you don't need to hear any of this." "I don't mind hearing it," Hannah said. "It doesn't bother you?" "Me talking about her?" Hannah set down the mending. "Emily, I am not trying to replace your mother. I couldn't. Nobody could. That's not why I'm here." She waited until the girl looked up. "I'm here because your father needed help, and I needed a place. That's the whole truth of it. Anything that grows beyond that..." She shook her head. "That's not something I'm planning or pushing for. It would have to be real, or it would be nothing." Emily stared at her for a long moment. "The second woman," she said slowly, "told us to call her mama on the second day." "Lord," Hannah said. "Yes." Something shifted in Emily's face, not quite a smile, but the shadow of what a smile might be. "It didn't go well." Hannah picked up the mending. She didn't say anything else. Neither did Emily. But she sat there until the shirt was finished, and when Hannah handed it to her to put away, she took it without a word, and the fact of her sitting there had been something, and they both knew it. The twist came on a Wednesday night, unexpected and cold as creek water in the dark, and it came through Noah. Noah Carter was 10 years old and had said perhaps 40 words to Hannah in 2 weeks. He watched everything with those level, serious eyes and offered nothing, and Hannah had respected his silence the way you respect a locked door, not trying to force it, just noting where it was. She'd thought if Noah came around it would be slow. She'd thought it would be on his own terms and his own timeline, and probably wordless when it happened. She was wrong about the wordless part. She found him outside after supper, sitting on the fence rail at the edge of the yard, looking at nothing in particular. The way people look at something particular when they don't want anyone to know what they're thinking about. "You finished your supper fast," she said. "Wasn't that hungry?" She leaned on the fence beside him. The evening was cooling slightly. Wyoming summers did that, gave back a little heat after dark enough to breathe. She didn't say anything. She just stood there. After a while, Noah said, "There's a man in town who's been talking to Emily." Hannah went still. "What kind of talking?" "The kind Dad doesn't know about." He kept his eyes on the horizon. "His name is Pete Doyle, Mrs. Doyle's nephew. He started showing up around when you arrived. Emily thinks he's sweet on her. Is she sweet on him? Emily doesn't know how to be sweet on anyone yet. He said this the way a 10-year-old says things that are wiser than they have any right to be. But she's 15, and she's been running this house for a year, and she's tired. And Pete Doyle is the kind of person who can tell when someone's tired and wants to seem like rest. Hannah turned to look at him. Why are you telling me this? Noah finally looked at her. His face was 10 years old and 40 years old at the same time, and he said, "Because I watch things. And what I've watched for 2 weeks is that you're not like the others. And because Pete Doyle's aunt has been telling people in town that my sister is sweet on her nephew, which will get back to my father, which will cause a problem." He paused. I can't tell my father. He'll go after Pete and there'll be trouble. I can't tell Emily. She'll stop talking to me. You're the only one left who might be able to actually do something. Hannah was quiet for a moment. What do you want me to do? I don't know, Noah said. That's what I'm asking you. She stood there in the cooling evening air and thought about a 15-year-old girl who'd been running a household since her mother died, and who was tired in the deepest way, the way that made shortcuts look like solutions. She thought about Margaret Doyle, who she was now quite sure had sent her nephew to that girl deliberately as a chess move in a longer game. I'll think about it, she said. Noah nodded. He got down from the fence and walked back toward the house. He'd said more words to her in 5 minutes than in the entire previous 2 weeks, and none of them had been about trust, and all of them had been exactly that. She handled Emily the only way she knew how, sideways like Luke, because the Carter children seemed to understand sideways better than straight on. She asked Emily to help her with the bread the next morning, which Emily did with the specific air of someone doing a favor, and while they worked, Hannah said conversationally, as if it had nothing to do with anything, Mrs. Doyle strikes me as someone who makes moves in advance. Emily's hands slowed on the dough. What do you mean? I mean, I've seen her type before. Women like that don't just respond to situations. They create them. Hannah kept working. The kinds of situations where other people end up looking foolish or in trouble or obligated to her in some way. It's a skill what she does. You have to watch for the setup, not the move itself. Silence. The sound of the dough. Why are you telling me this? Emily asked. Her voice was careful. No reason in particular. Hannah shaped a loaf. Just find it's worth knowing how people operate before you decide who to be around. Emily was quiet for a long time. Then she said so quietly, Hannah almost missed it. Pete Doyle offered to take me riding on Saturday. Did he? I was going to say yes. That's your right, Hannah said. He might be perfectly fine. Mrs. Doyle might have nothing to do with it. She paused. Just be the kind of girl who finds out which before she's already riding. Emily's hands went still on the dough. She stood there thinking something through, and Hannah could almost see it moving across her face, some calculation that wasn't finished yet, some question she hadn't finished asking herself. She didn't say she'd cancel Saturday, but she didn't say she wouldn't. And on Saturday morning, she was in the yard helping Noah repair the fence rail when Pete Doyle's horse came up the road, and she didn't go in to change her dress. And when Pete Doyle looked toward the yard and tipped his hat, Emily looked right back at him and kept working. Hannah from the kitchen window watched this without expression. She turned back to the stove. The afternoon Luke disappeared. The sky had been threatening all day, that particular yellow-gray color that Wyoming sky gets in midsummer before a serious storm, low and pressurized and full of intention. Hannah had mentioned it at noon. Samuel had nodded and said he'd have the animals secured by 4. Luke had looked out the window and said nothing, which was his standard contribution to most conversations. By 3 o'clock, Luke was not in the barn, not in the yard, not in any of the places he was usually not quite visible but present. By 3:30, Noah said quietly, "He goes down to the creek sometimes, when things are bad." Hannah looked at him. "What's bad today?" Noah was quiet for a moment. Today's the day Mama fell. She understood that without explanation. the anniversary of the accident. The day the shape of everything changed. She hadn't known. Nobody had told her because nobody had thought to tell her or wanted to think about it themselves. "Does your father know he goes to the creek?" she asked. "Dad doesn't know what day it is today either," Noah said. He said it without bitterness, just as a fact, the kind that costs something to say. She looked out the window at the sky, which had gone a darker shade of wrong. "How far's the creek?" she asked. "1.5 miles, maybe 2. The first roll of thunder moved through the air like a hand pressing down. "Get your father," Hannah said. She was already reaching for her coat. Samuel came out of the barn at a run when he heard, and the look on his face when Noah told him what day it was, that look was a whole year of grief compressed into 3 seconds. And Hannah saw it, and looked away because it wasn't hers to witness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "I'll go," Samuel said. "We'll both go," Hannah said. He looked at her. Some argument moved through his eyes and dissolved before it reached his mouth, and he nodded once and they went. The storm broke when they were halfway there. Not a gentle rain. Wyoming didn't do gentle in summer. It came down like something that had been holding its breath and finally let go sudden and total, the road turning to mud in minutes, the sky going from gray to near dark between one step and the next. Hannah ran behind Samuel and kept running when the ground turned slick, and her boots went wrong twice, and she caught herself both times without slowing. She heard the creek before she saw it. In summer, it was usually low and quick and manageable. After 3 weeks of dry heat, and then this in the space of 20 minutes, it was something else entirely. Luke was on the far bank. He was standing at the edge, with the water already above the usual crossing stones white and moving fast, and he was looking at the water like a boy who had come here to think about one thing and found himself looking at another thing entirely, and he didn't hear them over the rain until Samuel shouted his name. Luke looked up. Something in his face collapsed the hard front he kept up collapsing the way a wall collapses when the thing holding it up is suddenly gone, and Hannah saw for the first time not the hostile, capable 13-year-old who moved her scissors and unlatched her chicken coop, but a boy who had come to the place where his mother died looking for something he couldn't name, and found himself trapped across a river in a storm. "Don't move," Samuel shouted. "Stay right there." The old wooden bridge was 50 yards downstream. Samuel was already moving toward it. Hannah was closer. She looked at the water, assessed it the way her father had taught her to assess moving water when she was a girl in Tennessee depth speed, the way it was moving around the rocks. Fast. Cold. Chest deep at the middle probably. Manageable. Barely. She looked at Luke on the far bank, who was looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. She went in. The cold was a shock even in summer mountain-fed water that hadn't gotten the message about July, and the current pushed at her legs, and she pushed back. Arms out, moving diagonally like her father had shown her, angling with the current rather than against it. 3 steps. 4 steps, the bottom uneven and shifting underfoot. The water at her waist, and then higher. And then she was across, stumbling up the far bank, soaked to the skin, and Luke was standing 3 feet away, staring at her like she'd done something impossible. "Come on," she said, breathing hard. She held out her hand. He didn't take it, but he moved. He fell into step beside her, and they went back across together. Hannah keeping her body angled against the current, and Luke following her line exactly without being told to, because Luke Carter was 13, and furious and grieving, and also not stupid. Samuel met them on the near bank and pulled Luke against him in a grip that didn't look like it was going to loosen anytime soon, and Luke's arms went up around his father's back, and the sound he made was not a sound a 13-year-old usually lets anyone hear. Hannah stood in the rain 5 feet away, soaked and shaking with cold, and looked at the sky and gave them that. After a long moment, Samuel looked up at her over Luke's shoulder. His face said something she wasn't ready to translate yet. The rain kept coming down. And then behind her, from the direction of the road, she heard a horse. And then another. And then a voice she recognized as belonging to a man who ran the feed store in town, carrying through the rain. That's her. That's the Carter woman. And she turned, and there were 3 people on horseback on the road, and one of them was Margaret Doyle. Even in the rain from this distance, Hannah could see the way Margaret was watching. Not alarmed, not relieved. Just watching the way you watch something you've been expecting, something you've already decided how to describe before you've seen it fully. Hannah understood in that moment, with the cold water still in her boots and Samuel still holding his son on the bank behind her, what story was going to be told in Cutter's Creek tomorrow morning. She understood it, and she couldn't stop it, and she stood in the rain and felt something that was not defeat and not quite fury, but the exhausted space between them. The storm pressed on. The creek ran fast and loud at her back, and she stood there soaked and shaking, and still exactly where she'd decided to be because the only alternative was not being there at all. And that was not something Hannah Brooks was willing to do. They got back to the ranch well after dark, soaked through and mud-streaked, and nobody said much of anything. Samuel got Luke inside and up the stairs, and Hannah heard the low murmur of voices through the ceiling while she stood in the kitchen wringing water out of her sleeves into the sink. Daisy appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, took one look at Hannah, and disappeared. She came back 30 seconds later with a dry dish towel which she held out at arm's length without quite making eye contact. "Thank you, Daisy," Hannah said. Daisy nodded. She stood there a moment longer. Then she said very quietly, "Is Luke okay?" "Luke is fine. He's upstairs with your father." Another nod. Then, "You're bleeding." Hannah looked down. There was a thin cut along her left forearm from something in the water. A rock. Probably she hadn't felt it, and it had bled enough to show through the wet sleeve. Not deep. Not serious. She hadn't noticed it at all. "It's nothing," Hannah said. "Mama kept the bandages in the blue tin on the second shelf," Daisy said. Then she turned and went back up the stairs before Hannah could say anything else. Hannah found the blue tin on the second shelf. She bandaged her own arm in the quiet kitchen while the rain finished itself off outside, tapering from a roar to a murmur, to a last few irregular drops on the roof. She was still cold. She needed dry clothes and sleep. She had neither yet. She was tying off the bandage when she heard boots on the stairs. Samuel came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw her arm. His jaw tightened. "You're hurt," he said. "I'm fine." "Hannah." He said her name like it was a door he wasn't sure he had the right to open. "Let me see." She held out her arm. He looked at the bandage. She'd done it neatly, cleanly, and some of the tension left his face replaced by something more complicated. He let go of her arm and stepped back and ran a hand over the back of his neck in a gesture she'd come to recognize as Samuel Carter's version of not knowing what to do with himself. "Luke's asleep," he said. "Good." He stopped, tried again. "He doesn't usually let anyone see him like that." "I know. What you did tonight was what needed doing," Hannah said. "You don't have to make a speech about it." He looked at her. Something moved across his face that had no clean name, not quite gratitude, and not quite something softer, and not quite the careful controlled distance he'd been maintaining since she arrived. It was something in between all of those things, something that hadn't decided yet what it was going to be. "Get some sleep," he said finally. "I'll handle the morning." She almost said she didn't need him to handle anything. She stopped herself. She nodded once and went upstairs. She lay on the narrow bed in her room and listened to the house settle around her, and did not think about the 3 riders on the road in the rain or what story was being constructed about her right now in Margaret Doyle's parlor. And she did not think about Thomas, and she did not think about what Samuel Carter's face had looked like when he'd said her name, and she was asleep before she'd finished, not thinking about any of it. Margaret's version of what happened reached town before breakfast. Hannah knew, because Walt from the livery came by mid-morning with the delivery of feed and couldn't quite look at her while he unloaded it. And because the woman who ran the post office sent her 13-year-old son with a letter addressed to Samuel that the boy handed over with the expression of someone who had been told things and was trying not to show it. Hannah didn't read the letter. She set it on Samuel's desk and went back to the kitchen. She heard about the actual contents that afternoon when Emily came in from town with flour and a careful, controlled expression that meant she'd heard something and hadn't decided yet whether to say it. Say it. Hannah said, without turning from the stove. Emily set the flour down. Mrs. Doyle is telling people you dragged Luke to the creek on purpose, so you could save him and look like a hero. Hannah turned the flame down. Is she? She says she saw you there before Dad arrived. She says the timing was suspicious. Emily's voice was careful and precise. She says a woman who shows up with nothing and no references and no family connections would do anything to secure her position. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, Ben was chasing a chicken across the yard, narrating the chase to himself in a running commentary that drifted in through the open window. Do you believe her? Hannah asked. Emily was quiet for a moment. A real moment she was actually thinking, not just performing thought. No, she said finally. I was there when Noah said Luke goes to the creek on the bad days. I know you didn't know that before he told you. She paused. But other people don't know that. And Mrs. Doyle tells a story better than you'd think. I know she does, Hannah said. What are you going to do? Hannah turned back to the stove. Cook supper. That's your answer? That's what I can control right now. So yes, that's my answer. Emily was quiet for a beat. Then, and this was new, this was something Hannah hadn't heard before. That's what Mama would have said. Hannah didn't turn around. She kept her hands moving. She didn't let herself react to that the way she wanted to, because reacting to it would have made it something Emily wasn't ready for it to be. Your mother sounds like she had good sense, Hannah said evenly. She heard Emily exhale a long, careful breath like something being slowly set down. Then the sound of Emily putting the flour away in exactly the right place, on exactly the right shelf. Luke came to the kitchen doorway the next morning and stood there for a while without saying anything. Hannah was making biscuits. She knew he was there, and she let him stand. Finally he said, I didn't need you to come in after me. I know, Hannah said. I could have crossed on my own. Maybe, maybe not. She shaped a biscuit and set it on the pan. Current was moving pretty fast. I've crossed worse. Could be. She shaped another biscuit. I didn't know that at the time. I went in with what I knew at the time. Silence. The sound of biscuit making. Why'd you do it? He asked. She considered giving him the easy answer. She decided against it. Because you're 13 years old, and the creek was flooding, and the bridge was 50 yards away, and I was closer. She looked at him over her shoulder. That's all, Luke. No other reason. I'm not asking you to feel anything about it. He looked at her with those difficult dark eyes that were his father's eyes, with an extra layer of something anguished in them. Mrs. Doyle says you did it to make us trust you. Mrs. Doyle says a lot of things. Hannah turned back to the pan. What do you think? A long pause. I think, Luke said slowly, like each word cost him something, that the water was cold, and you went in anyway. He stopped. And I think maybe that's harder to fake than most things. He left before she could answer. The back door closed quietly. Hannah stood at the counter for a moment with her hands still and flour on her fingers and something in her chest that she needed a minute to manage before she went back to work. She gave herself 30 seconds. Then she went back to work. The twist nobody saw coming arrived on a Sunday from a direction nobody had been watching. It came in the form of a letter. Not the letter from the post office woman. A different letter, this one addressed to Hannah in handwriting she didn't recognize, with a return address from Cheyenne. She opened it at the kitchen table after supper, when the children had gone up and Samuel was on the porch. She read it twice. Then she sat very still for a long time. The letter was from a lawyer. A real one, firm name proper, addressed the kind of letter that didn't get written without a reason. It said in the careful language of the legal profession that a woman named Hannah Brooks, formerly of Nashville, Tennessee, was named in the estate of one Thomas Brooks deceased as the recipient of a parcel of land in eastern Wyoming that Thomas had purchased 2 years before his death, the deed of which had only now been located and processed. The parcel was modest. It was real. It was hers. She had known Thomas bought land out west. He'd talked about it, some idea about starting fresh, about space, about a future he was building toward that they'd get to together someday. She'd thought it was just that talk, the kind of dreaming men do when they're trying to convince themselves the world is larger than the one they're standing in. He'd actually done it. She sat at the table with the letter in her hands and thought about Thomas for the first time since she'd put his photograph face down in the drawer, and it didn't feel like grief the way grief had felt for 14 months. It felt like something different, like a hand that had been reaching for something finally finding the shape of what it was reaching for. She was not, as Margaret Doyle had told anyone who would listen, a woman with nothing. She had never been a woman with nothing. She had just been a woman with a hand no one had let her play yet. She folded the letter. She put it in the pocket of her dress. She thought about what it meant. She thought about Samuel on the porch, about 5 children distributed across the rooms above her, about whether this land changed what she was doing here, whether it changed her options, whether it changed anything at all. It changed her position. It did not change her mind. She got up and washed the supper dishes, and when Samuel came inside, she was drying the last pan, and she said without turning around, "I need to tell you something." He stopped. "All right." She turned and looked at him straight on. "I have land, an inheritance from my husband, about 40 miles east of here. I didn't know about it until an hour ago." He was very still. "Why are you telling me?" "Because you should know who you're dealing with." She set the pan down. "Margaret Doyle has been telling this town, I came here with nothing and am trying to take something. I want you to know that's not what's happening. I came here to work. That's still what I'm doing. But I'm not a desperate woman anymore, Mr. Carter. I may have been when I arrived. I'm not now." She held his gaze. "I'm staying because I choose to stay. I think you ought to know the difference." Samuel Carter looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "That's considerable land," he said carefully. "Yes. You could leave." "I could have left 11 days ago," Hannah said. "I'm still here." He didn't say anything, but the way he looked at her shifted some fundamental adjustment in the way he was seeing her, the way a lens shifts when it finally finds the right focus. "I'll sleep on what to do about Margaret," he said. "So will I," Hannah said. "We'll see who comes up with the better answer." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one briefly. He went to bed. Hannah stood in the quiet kitchen and felt the weight of the letter in her pocket and thought, "Thomas, you impossible man. You bought land in Wyoming." She almost laughed. She didn't, but she almost did. The fever started on Tuesday night. Not Luke. Not the child anyone was watching. Ben, 4 years old smallest, who'd been eating Hannah's oatmeal and following her around the yard and calling her the lady, in a tone that had been slowly warming from suspicious to something adjacent to fond. He was hot when she picked him up to carry him to bed, noticeably hotter than he should have been, and fussed in a way that was different from his usual fussing. Something slow and resistant about it, like a child fighting a battle he didn't have full energy for. She put her hand on his forehead and felt the heat radiating and said evenly, "Emily." Emily appeared at the top of the stairs. She took one look at Ben in Hannah's arms and came down fast. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough," Hannah said. "Get your father." By midnight, the fever had climbed. Hannah had dealt with fevers before she'd nursed Thomas through one, and she'd done it long enough to know the ones that were manageable and the ones that ran toward dangerous faster than you could keep up with them. This one was moving fast. Ben was hot and glassy-eyed and intermittently delirious, calling for people who weren't in the room. His small body burning through her attempts to cool it, like the heat had its own intention. Samuel sat on one side of the bed, and Hannah worked on the other, and neither of them said anything unnecessary, which was the right way to handle a fever at midnight. No speeches, no explanation, just doing. She applied cold cloths and changed them when they warmed. She got water into him, a small spoonful at a time. She talked to him in a low, steady voice when he got agitated, not about anything in particular, just sound, just the consistent presence of a calm human voice, telling him without words that someone was there. Around 2 in the morning, Samuel said quietly, "Clara was good at this." Hannah changed the cloth on Ben's forehead. "I imagine she was good at most things. She never panicked." He looked at his son's face. "I always panicked, and she never did, and that made me feel like a fool, which made me argue with her, which—" He stopped. "Which you'd probably rather have back," Hannah said. "Every day." His voice was flat and honest. Every single day. They sat on either side of his small son, and the night moved around them, and Hannah kept working, and sometime around 4 in the morning, the fever broke. Not all at once, but in the slow, measured way of a tide going out. Ben's temperature dropping degree by degree, his breathing steadying his fists, unclenching, until he was just sleeping. Just a small boy sleeping in the way children sleep when they've been through something hard, and their bodies are reclaiming normal. Samuel let out a breath like he'd been holding it for hours. "He's going to be all right," Hannah said. "I know." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I know that now." He looked at her across the bed, across his sleeping son. "Thank you." "Don't," Hannah said. "Don't what?" "Don't thank me like I did you a favor. He's a child. You thank me like that, and it puts distance between us that doesn't need to be there." She met his eyes. "I was here, that's all." Samuel Carter looked at her across the narrow bed with the lamp burning low between them, and the summer night finally cooling outside the window, and he said nothing. But the way he looked at her was not the way he'd looked at a problem he wasn't sure how to solve. It was the way a man looks at something he's been trying not to see clearly, because seeing it clearly would mean deciding what to do about it. She looked back at him until he looked away. She wasn't going to make it easy for him, but she wasn't going to pretend she hadn't seen it either. The children found out about the letter the wrong way. Hannah hadn't told them, she hadn't decided how or when. But in a house with 5 children, a letter-shaped piece of information didn't stay contained for long. Noah, who missed nothing, found the folded document on the kitchen shelf where Hannah had placed it temporarily, and he read enough of it to understand the shape of it. And then he told Emily, because Noah told Emily things the way lungs tell the body, it needs air reflexively necessarily. Emily came to Hannah that afternoon with the expression of someone who has been readjusting a calculation and isn't finished yet. "You own land," she said. "Yes." "You could have left before you even got here properly." "Yes." Emily stared at her. "Why didn't you—" Hannah looked at her. "Because by the time I found out, I'd already decided this was worth staying for." She let that sit. "That might not make sense to you." "No, Emily stopped. Started again. "I told Pete Doyle that you were probably going to leave, that it wasn't worth—" She pressed her lips together. "He said he'd heard you'd be gone by August, from his aunt." She looked at the floor. "I repeated it, in town, a few days ago. I didn't think it mattered." "Emily, I know." She looked up, and the careful, brittle control in her face had given way to something younger and rawer and genuinely upset. "I know. I'm sorry. I didn't know you were—" She stopped again. "I didn't know you were actually here. I thought you were just another person passing through." "I'm not passing through," Hannah said. "I'm starting to see that." Emily's voice had gone quiet. "I'm starting to see a lot of things I should have seen before." Hannah sat down at the table. She looked at this 15-year-old girl who had been running a household for a year, and grieving for longer, who had defended her family the only way she knew how, which was by making herself a wall between them and anything new. "You don't need to apologize for protecting them," Hannah said. "That's what you've been doing. I know that." "I could have—" "You're 15, Emily. You did the best you knew how." She waited until the girl's eyes were on her. "I'm asking you to let me do what I know how to do. That's all. Nobody's asking you to stop loving them or stop being who you are." Emily was quiet for a long moment. Something in her was working through something that had no quick resolution, no clean ending. She was 15, and she was trying, and that mattered more than getting it right on the first try. "What if—" she started, and that was when Daisy screamed from the yard. Not a playing scream, the other kind. Both of them were on their feet and moving before the sound finished. They found Daisy at the edge of the yard pointing toward the road, and the road was wrong. Something dark and fast on it, a horse with an empty saddle running loose and hard from the direction of the east pasture and Samuel's horse. Samuel's horse. Emily grabbed Daisy before Hannah was even through the gate, and Hannah was already running toward the east pasture, toward whatever had sent a riderless horse toward the house running in the afternoon heat, with the dry ground hard under her boots, and her heart doing something loud and irregular that she wasn't going to pay attention to, not yet, not until she knew. She found Samuel 200 yards into the pasture. He was on the ground beside the fence line, sitting up, which she registered with relief so acute it was almost physical, holding his left arm against his chest, and looking at it with the expression of a man assessing damage with the part of his brain that has not yet begun to feel the full extent of it. He looked up when she reached him. "Fence wire," he said before she could ask. "Horse spooked. I went down wrong." He moved his arm slightly, and the color drained from his face in a way that was very informative about how wrong the going down had been. "Don't move it," Hannah said. She was already kneeling. "I need to get up. You need to stop moving your arm. Give me a moment." He held still, which told her the pain was serious because Samuel Carter was not a man who held still easily. She assessed what she could without moving him more than necessary. The arm wasn't angled in any way that suggested a bad break. The wrist was the problem, swollen, already moving toward badly swollen tender, in a way that made him pull breath sharply through his teeth when she tested it. "You need a doctor," she said. "Doc Reeves is in Cheyenne until Thursday." "I know. I need to splint this tonight and you need to see him Thursday." She looked at him. "You're going to let me do this?" "I'm not arguing." "You were about to." "I was about to say I've set my own wrist before." "How many times?" she asked, already standing, already calculating what she needed and where it was. "Twice," he said. "Good. Then you know how to hold still." She met his eyes. "Hold still, Samuel." He held still. She worked with what she had. She'd sent Daisy back to the house for the medical kit before she'd even reached Samuel, which turned out to have been the right call, because Daisy arrived at a dead run 3 minutes later with the tin box clutched to her chest and her face absolutely serious, with the focus of a child who knows she is in the middle of something that matters. "Good girl," Hannah said, and Daisy squared her shoulders like a soldier. She set the wrist and splinted it and bound it correctly, and Samuel made no sound through any of it, except for one sharp, bitten-off syllable when she set the bone, and then he was quiet again. When she finished, he looked at his splinted arm for a moment. "That's better than the last 2 times, he said. "The last 2 times? You said it yourself," Hannah said. She started packing the kit. "You've done this before. My husband broke his wrist twice, my younger brother 3 times. She latched the tin. "I was elected the family bone setter by default. I'm not a doctor." "Close enough tonight," Samuel said. He looked at her. She was still kneeling in the dirt of the east pasture with the afternoon light coming down at a low angle, and the tin box on the ground beside her, and her hair coming loose from its pin from running. And he was looking at her with that unguarded look he'd had in the kitchen before he'd looked away from it, except this time he didn't look away. He said, "I've been underestimating you." She closed the kit. "I know you have." "I'm trying to stop." "I know that too," Hannah said. She stood. She reached out her right hand. "Now get up. Your children are watching from the fence and at least 2 of them are about to cry." He looked. She was right. All 5 of them were at the fence. Various expressions on various faces, and Daisy was already crying, and Ben was holding Emily's hand with both of his. He took her hand. He stood. They walked back toward the fence together toward the 5 children watching, and the summer evening pressed warm around them, and behind them the east pasture went quiet. Luke, when they reached the fence, looked at his father's arm. He looked at Hannah. He looked at the space between them, and whatever calculation he ran was brief and quiet and finished quickly. He opened the fence gate without being asked. Hannah walked through first. Samuel followed. And when Ben pulled free of Emily's hand and reached up for Hannah with both arms, in the way children reach for the person they suddenly most need to be held by, she picked him up without hesitation, and he pressed his face against her shoulder, and she felt the weight of him and held it. Luke watched this. He didn't say anything, but he latched the gate behind them, and he stayed close on the walk back to the house. And when Hannah said she needed more water heated for the medical kit, he was the one who went to build up the fire. Without being asked, without a word. Just did it. And Hannah thought, there it is. That was the thing she'd been counting toward without knowing the final number. The moment when the ground shifted under the whole argument, when what had been impossible started becoming merely difficult, when a locked door moved a quarter-inch on its hinges, and you understood for the first time that it could open. It could open. She sat at the kitchen table with Ben still in her lap, while the fire built, and Samuel's children moved around her in the lamplit kitchen, and the summer night came down around the house, and Hannah Brooks, who had arrived with a carpet bag and a letter and nothing else, sat in the middle of the family she had not yet earned the right to call hers. But she was closer than she'd ever been. And so were they. 3 days after Samuel's wrist, the town started talking in a different register. Not louder, quieter. That particular kind of quiet that means people have stopped speculating and started deciding which is always more dangerous. Hannah heard it in the way Walt from the livery spoke to her on Thursday, when she brought Samuel in to see Doc Reeves, a careful, measuring politeness that had replaced his earlier avoidance, like a man revising an opinion he hadn't admitted to holding. She heard it in the way the woman at the dry goods counter asked after Samuel's arm with a warmth that was slightly too deliberate to be entirely natural. People were watching her differently. She wasn't sure yet if that was better or worse. Doc Reeves confirmed the wrist was set correctly and said so in a tone that contained a question he didn't ask out loud, looking at Hannah over his spectacles with the frank appraisal of a man who'd been practicing medicine in a small town for 30 years and had developed opinions about who was capable of what. "You set this?" he asked. "I did," Hannah said. "Clean work." He rewrapped it. "You have medical training." "I have brothers and a husband who were hard on their bones," she said. He looked at her a moment longer. "Samuel, this woman's more useful than you've been letting on." Samuel, who had been sitting through the examination in the stoic silence of a man who finds doctors philosophically objectionable, said, "I'm aware of that." Hannah looked at the window. The shift in the children happened the way shifts in children always happen all at once, after so long it seemed impossible, like water that's been cold for weeks, suddenly tipping over into ice. Not all 5 at once, but close enough. Ben had stopped calling her the lady. He'd landed on something of his own construction that nobody had prompted and nobody questioned. He called her my Hannah. Said it with the proprietary confidence of a 4-year-old who has decided something is his and is not interested in debate. Hannah heard it the first time while she was hanging washing, and he was in the yard behind her, and he called across to Noah. "My Hannah says we're having corn cake tonight." She kept her back to the yard, and her hands moving on the washing, and waited until the moment had passed before she allowed herself to feel what that did to her. Noah, who had always been the one she understood best, and least simultaneously, began a new habit of sitting in the kitchen while she worked. Not helping, not talking, just being there, reading his book at the kitchen table present, in the particular way that means a person has decided you are safe to be near. It was the highest compliment Noah Carter knew how to pay, and he paid it without ceremony, dropping it like a stone into still water and walking away from the ripple. Daisy was the most openly tender of all of them, which was consistent with who she was. She touched Hannah's arm sometimes, when she passed small butterfly touches there, and gone checking that Hannah was real and still present. She began bringing Hannah small things, a good rock from the yard, a wildflower, once a bird feather she'd found by the fence and decided was worth saving. Hannah kept all of it on the windowsill above the kitchen sink. Daisy had noticed it was there and hadn't said anything, but had brought another feather the following week. Emily was the most complicated and the most real. She didn't perform her changing. She lived it awkwardly and honestly, the way a person lives a genuine change, which means they go 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and sometimes stand still for a whole day, because they don't know which direction to go. She apologized to Hannah for the Pete Doyle situation once thoroughly and without excuse, and Hannah accepted it the same way, and neither of them revisited it. What grew between them after that was tentative and imprecise, and nothing like what Emily had had with Clara Carter, but it was real, and they both knew it was real, and that was its own kind of thing. Luke was last. He didn't make an announcement about it. He didn't apologize or explain himself. He simply began one unremarkable morning showing up to help with things he'd previously ignored, bringing in wood, before she asked, checking the chicken coop appearing at her shoulder when something needed lifting. He did it all with his jaw set and his face at its most neutral, like a man completing a transaction he'd decided was fair without being required to like it. Hannah matched his neutrality exactly. They worked side by side in a silence that was entirely different from the hostile silence of 4 weeks ago, and neither of them pointed that out because pointing it out would have ruined it. What Luke actually said on a Thursday evening, when they happened to be the only 2 people in the kitchen, was that stew last week, the one with the dumplings. Hannah was washing a pan. What about it? Mama used to make that. He was standing by the window, not looking at her. I didn't say anything at the time. I noticed. He stopped. I wanted to tell you it was good. That's all. He moved toward the door. Just that it was good. He left. Hannah stood at the sink with the pan in her hands and the steam rising from the water, and she thought 11 days he lasted under the same roof before I became real to him. And then she thought about the number she'd been counting to all along and realized she'd lost track of it somewhere around the time Samuel's horse came back without him. The twist came from a direction she hadn't fully guarded. It came on a Saturday, in the form of a formal letter delivered to Samuel from the Cutters Creek Town Council. 3 men, all of whom Hannah recognized as regular attendees of whatever gathering happened at Margaret Doyle's store on Friday afternoons. The letter was politely worded and carried the collective weight of people who have convinced themselves they're acting in someone else's interest while acting entirely in their own. It said in formal language that certain concerns had been raised about the welfare of the Carter children in light of the current domestic arrangement, specifically regarding the character and background of the woman employed at the Carter Ranch, and that a meeting with Mr. Carter at his earliest convenience was respectfully requested. Samuel read it at this kitchen table. He set it down. He read it again. They can't do anything, Hannah said. She'd read it over his shoulder. They can make enough noise to make my life difficult. His voice was controlled, in the way of a man being careful with something hot. And they can make your life difficult. My life has been difficult since I stepped off the stagecoach. Hannah. He looked up at her. This is Margaret calling in favors. She's been building toward something, and this is what it looks like when she gets there. He pushed the letter across the table. She has 2 of those 3 men in her pocket. Has for years. They'll say whatever she wants them to say. Then we answer it, Hannah said. How? The same way we've answered everything else. She sat down across from him. Directly. You go to that meeting and you tell them the truth about what's been happening in this house, about Luke and the creek, about Ben's fever, about your wrist. She held his gaze. The truth is a better story than anything Margaret's constructed, but you have to be willing to tell it in public. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not good at that. I know you're not. Clara was... He stopped. Clara could talk to anyone, walked into a room and made people comfortable like she breathed it. I never... He rubbed the back of his neck. I'm better with fences. Then think of it as a fence, Hannah said. You're not convincing them. You're just setting a boundary. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the letter. Then he picked it up and folded it in half. I'll go Monday, he said. I'll go with you, Hannah said. They're not asking for you. I know. I'm going anyway. She met his eyes without wavering. I'm done letting other people tell my story while I'm standing 50 feet away. He held her gaze. Something settled in him. She could see it, the specific kind of settling that happens when a man who has been carrying something alone realizes he doesn't have to, and allows himself carefully and without ceremony to put part of it down. All right, he said. What happened at Monday's meeting was not what the town council had arranged for. There were the three men as expected, seated at the table in the back room of the post office with the official air of people performing importance. Two of them watched Hannah enter behind Samuel with expressions of poorly concealed surprise. They'd known about her, heard the stories. But apparently, Margaret's version had prepared them for something less composed than the woman who took a seat beside Samuel Carter and met each of their eyes in turn, without hesitation. The third man, who Hannah hadn't placed before, was older 60, at least weathered and deliberate, with the quality of stillness that belongs to people who have survived enough that they've stopped being in a hurry. He looked at Hannah differently from the others. Not with hostility, with something closer to assessment. They went through their concerns, which were Margaret's concerns, arranged in official language. Hannah's background was unverified. She had arrived with no references. There were questions about her character raised by multiple members of the community. The welfare of 5 children was not a matter to take lightly. Samuel answered all of it in the plain, careful way of a man who has decided to be a fence. He talked about Luke and the creek. He talked about Ben's fever. He showed them his wrist. He did not editorialize or persuade. He told them what had happened and let it stand. Hannah added one thing. She took the lawyer's letter from her pocket. She had carried it with her deliberately and placed it on the table. I'm not a woman who arrived with nothing, she said. I have land. I have means. I am at the Carter Ranch because I chose to be, and Mr. Carter chose to have me there, and the children have come to a kind of peace with my presence that was hard-won and real. She looked at the man who'd been assessing her. I understand there are concerns about character. The difficulty with character is that it's visible in behavior, not in paperwork. You would need to observe it, or you could ask the people who have. The older man spoke for the first time. I'm Hector Briggs. I was friends with Samuel's father for 40 years. He looked at Samuel. Doc Reeves told me about the wrist. He looked at Hannah. He told me about the setting of it too. He drummed his fingers once on the table. Margaret Doyle is a woman who means well and sees narrow, he said. These other two. He looked at his companions with an expression of mild disdain. Mean well, somewhat less reliably. He pushed the lawyer's letter back across the table toward Hannah. I don't think we need to formalize any further concern. Anything else you gentlemen need to discuss can be discussed without me. He stood. He looked at Hannah. He tipped his head. He left. The other two men looked at each other. The meeting dissolved in the way meetings dissolve when their purpose has evaporated quickly, with the minimum amount of formal language required to make the dissolution seem intentional. Samuel and Hannah walked out of the post office into the summer morning and stood on the boardwalk, and she let out one long, controlled breath. Hector Briggs, she said. He was my father's best friend, Samuel said. He doesn't usually come to town council meetings. He looked at her sideways. He came to this one. Word travels, Hannah said. It does. He was quiet for a moment. You brought the letter on purpose. Of course I did. You planned that. I plan most things, Hannah said. I just do it quietly. He looked at her with that look again, the one that had no single clean name, the one she'd been careful not to read too much into. She was still being careful. They walked to the wagon. Margaret appeared that afternoon. Hannah was in the yard with Daisy teaching her the basics of mending on a scrap of old cloth when the buggy came up the road. Samuel was in the barn. The children were distributed across the property in their various afternoon occupations. It was Hannah and Daisy and the summer heat, and then suddenly, it was those things, and Margaret Doyle standing at the yard gate with her pleasant expression operating at full capacity. Miss Brooks, she said, I heard the meeting went well. It did, Hannah said. She kept her needle moving. Hector Briggs is a respected man, Margaret said. His opinion carries weight. I noticed. I want you to understand. Margaret paused, recalibrated. I acted out of concern for these children. Whatever you may think of my methods, my concern for this family is genuine. Hannah set down the mending. She looked at Margaret Doyle across the fence at the woman who had spent 2 months constructing obstacles in her path, and she thought about what to say. She thought about anger which she had and had been managing. She thought about the version of this conversation where she listed everything Margaret had done, every rumor, every calculation, every chess move made through Pete Doyle and the town council and the letter and the women in the dry goods store. She chose something different. I believe you, Hannah said. Margaret blinked. I think you genuinely care about Samuel and these children, Hannah said. I think you've been watching over this family for a year, and you decided I was a threat to something you were protecting. She held Margaret's gaze. You weren't entirely wrong to be careful. You were wrong about me specifically. But the instinct, that part I understand. Margaret was quiet. Whatever she'd come here to say had been displaced by what she'd just heard, and she was standing in the space that left recalculating. She stopped. You don't have to say anything, Hannah said. She picked up the mending again. I'm just telling you, I understand the difference between malice and fear. I don't think what you did was all malice. Daisy was watching Margaret with the enormous, watchful eyes of a child who knows something important is happening and is cataloging it for future reference. Margaret looked at Daisy. Something moved across her face, complicated, genuine, a little bit raw. She has Clara's eyes, Margaret said quietly. I know, Hannah said. I've noticed. Margaret nodded once. She looked at Hannah for a long moment, an actual looking, not an assessment, just a person seeing another person without the layers of strategy and positioning that had been in the way before. Good afternoon, Miss Brooks, she said. Good afternoon, Mrs. Doyle, Hannah said. The buggy turned and went back down the road. Daisy looked up at Hannah. Are you friends now? Not exactly, Hannah said. She threaded her needle again, but maybe something a little better than enemies. Daisy considered this seriously, in the way she considered most things. Is that enough? For now, Hannah said. For now, it's plenty. Samuel found Hannah on the porch that evening after the children were in bed. He'd been quiet through supper. Not the old silence, the closed-door silence, but something more like a man who's working through something he hasn't yet found the right language for. He sat beside her on the porch swing, and the summer evening moved around them, the air finally beginning to give back the heat it had been holding all day. After a while, he said, I want to talk about the land. All right, Hannah said. Not because it changes your position here. I don't want you to think... He stopped. I want to talk about it because it's yours, and you've been here 2 months, and you haven't done anything about it, and I want to understand why. She looked at the dark pasture. I've thought about it. And I thought about what it means to have land 40 miles away when the place that feels like something is here. She was quiet a moment. Thomas bought that land before I knew him in Wyoming, before I knew any of this existed. He was building towards something in his head. I know he was, but he died before he could tell me the whole of it. She looked at her hands. I've been trying to figure out if the thing he was building toward and the thing I'm building toward are the same thing or different things. Are they? I think they might be the same thing, she said. I think he would have liked this. She paused. I think he would have liked you, which would have annoyed me considerably. Samuel made a sound that was definitively a short, quiet laugh. A real one. It surprised them both. He got it under control. He looked at the pasture. I'm not... He started, stopped. I'm not good at the thing where you say how you feel about a person. I know, Hannah said. Clara used to say I was the only man she'd ever met who could conduct an entire relationship entirely through carpentry. Hannah looked at him sideways. How many fences have you built since I got here? A pause. 4, he said. She smiled. She looked at the pasture, and she smiled. And she didn't let him see it because it would have embarrassed him, and she liked him too much to embarrass him right now. "The land," she said. "It'll keep. I'm not going anywhere." "I know you're not," he said. They sat in the swing in the summer evening, and the stars appeared one at a time, the way they do in Wyoming, not all at once, but gradually, like they're making up their minds. And Hannah thought about the letter in the kitchen drawer, and the photograph still face down in the chest, and the blue tin on the second shelf, and the row of small things on the kitchen windowsill. A good rock, a wildflower, a feather, another feather. She thought about the count she'd been keeping and realized she'd forgotten the number completely and that this was the best possible sign. The swing moved slow. The night settled in, and somewhere above them in the house, a small boy was sleeping who had started calling her "my Hannah," like it was simply true. Maybe Hannah thought it was. Maybe it simply was. The Sunday after the porch swing evening, Hannah woke before dawn to the smell of smoke. Not the ordinary smoke of a morning cook fire. Something different. Something with volume and intention behind it. The kind of smell that gets into your lungs before you're fully awake and tells your body to move before your mind has caught up. She was on her feet and at the window before she'd finished the thought, and what she saw down toward the edge of town made her stomach drop clean through the floor. The Hendersons' feed warehouse was on fire. Not a small fire. Not a fire that was going to be manageable with buckets and good intentions. It was the kind of fire that had been going for a while before anyone noticed that had found all the dry feed and the stored timber and the summer-seasoned wood of old walls and decided to make itself permanent. The sky above the building was lit orange, and even from the ranch she could see the sparks jumping. She was dressed in 40 seconds. She knocked hard on Samuel's door as she passed it. 3 sharp knocks, no words, and she was already at the stairs. She heard him move immediately, which told her he'd smelled it too. She went to Emily's room next, then Noah's, speaking low and fast. "Fire in town. Get up. Emily, I need you to keep the little ones here. Noah, wake Luke." Emily sat up instantly, already reaching for her dress. "How bad?" "Bad enough," Hannah said, and she was already moving. She rode Samuel's second horse into town because it was faster than the wagon, and the wagon was too slow for what she already understood was coming. Samuel was behind her on his own horse, his splinted wrist held against his chest, which she'd told him was foolish, and which he'd ignored with the specific stubbornness of a man who has decided his own injury is irrelevant information. The Hendersons' warehouse was on the east side of Cutter's Creek, which would have been a mercy, except that the wind that morning was coming from the west, which meant the sparks were jumping east toward the 3 buildings closest to the warehouse, one of which was the small house where old Mrs. Garrett lived alone, and one of which was the building where the Fielding family rented the upper rooms Carla Fielding and her 4 children, whose husband was away in Cheyenne for the week. Hannah knew all of this because she'd been living in this town for 2 months, and she'd been paying attention. She didn't slow when she reached the edge of the crowd that had gathered. She pushed through it, looking, assessing, finding the gaps where no one was looking, and the places where someone needed to be. She found Walt from the livery first. He was standing at the edge of the crowd, with the paralyzed look of a man who knows something is required of him and can't locate the specific thing. "Walt." She grabbed his arm. "Mrs. Garrett. Is she out?" He blinked. I don't know." "Go find out. Right now. Take someone with you." She was already moving. "If she's not out, you go in and get her. You hear me?" He moved. She'd given him something specific, and he could do something specific. She filed that away. In a crisis, the people who freeze don't need inspiration, they need instructions. She pushed further into the situation and found the Fielding building. No sign of Carla or the children at the front, which was wrong. The crowd was focused on the warehouse watching the fire, with the mesmerized expression of people confronting something too large to act on, and nobody was looking at the building to its left, where the second-floor windows were dark. Hannah ran. She hit the door with her shoulder, found it unlocked, went up the stairs calling Carla's name. The air was sharp with smoke, but not thick yet, "Not thick yet" was the key phrase, because it would be in minutes. Carla met her on the landing, already holding her youngest, and with the 3 older children clustered behind her. All of them dressed, but none of them moving, frozen in the specific paralysis of people who can see the danger, and cannot make themselves walk toward it, because walking toward it means walking through it. "There's too much smoke downstairs," Carla started. "There isn't yet. We have to go now before there is." Hannah took the youngest child from Carla's arms because Carla needed both hands to move fast. "Stay close. Don't stop. I'm right here." They went down, and they went out, and Hannah pushed the last child through the front door, into the clear air, and turned back once to make sure no one was behind her. Still in the building, and the smoke in the lower hall was thicker than it had been 90 seconds ago. And she thought 60 more seconds, and we couldn't have done that. She thought it very briefly, and then she moved the Fielding children away from the building, and didn't say it out loud. Walt found Mrs. Garrett. She'd been asleep, genuinely asleep through the whole thing, which was either remarkable or explained by the fact that Mrs. Garrett was 73 years old and had survived enough Wyoming winters that a fire 2 buildings over, apparently, did not constitute a sufficient disturbance to wake her. Walt had carried her out in her nightgown bundled in a quilt, and she was sitting on a barrel at the edge of the scene, looking more indignant than frightened and demanding to know what all the fuss was about. Hannah registered all of this in passing and kept moving. The warehouse itself was beyond saving. They all understood that now, but the priority had shifted to keeping the fire from jumping further. She found the men who were organized, which was maybe a third of the crowd, and she found the men who were not organized, which was the other 2/3, and she did what she'd done with Walt. She gave specific instructions to specific people, and moved on before they could argue. She was directing the water line buckets from the trough in a human chain toward the east wall of the nearest standing building when she became aware of someone at her side. She glanced over. Margaret Doyle. Not in crisis paralysis, not watching. Working her good dress ruined by smoke and water, her sleeves pushed up, taking a bucket from the line and passing it forward without being asked. Their eyes met for half a second. Margaret passed the bucket. Hannah passed the next one. They did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the buckets didn't say more efficiently. The fire took the warehouse completely and scorched the east wall of the nearest building and singed the roof edge of Mrs. Garrett's house, and then ran out of material and ran out of wind, and subsided into something manageable, and then something small, and then ash, and water, and the hard gray light of a morning that had started wrong and was slowly becoming ordinary. When it was over, Hannah sat on the edge of the water trough, and her hands were shaking slightly, which she noted with the detached interest of a person who has been operating purely on function for 2 hours and is now receiving news from their body. Samuel found her there. He sat beside her, his splinted wrist still against his chest, and looked at the wreckage of the warehouse and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Carla Fielding came and found me. She told me what you did." "It wasn't." "Don't," he said, not harshly, just firmly. "Don't minimize it. Let it be what it was." She looked at her shaking hands. "All right." He was quiet. Around them, the town was sorting itself out. Men talking in low groups, women gathering the children who'd been brought out in the confusion, someone laughing in the way people laugh when the crisis has passed and the relief comes out sideways. Normal human sounds. The sounds of a town that has been through something and is coming out the other side. "Hector Briggs is talking to people," Samuel said. Hannah looked up. "He's been here since the beginning. Watch the whole thing." Samuel looked at the crowd. "You know how many people came to help when they saw what was happening?" "I wasn't counting." Walt Reeves, Jim and Carl from the feed store, the Morley boys. Tom Garrett, he rode in from his farm, must have seen the light from 2 miles out. He paused. "These are not people who helped because they were organized. They helped because someone told them specifically what to do, and that someone was you." Hannah was quiet. "People saw," he said simply. "Cutter's Creek is a small town. People were watching." He looked at her. It's different to hear a story about someone than to watch them move through a crisis with their own eyes. Margaret can't construct a story over something people watched with their own eyes. Hannah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She was in the bucket line." He turned to look at her sharply. "Margaret," Hannah said. "She showed up and got in the bucket line. She didn't say anything. She just worked." Samuel's expression moved through several things quickly. "I didn't know that." "Nobody needs to make anything of it," Hannah said. "She just did it. That's enough." He looked at her with that look, the one she'd stopped trying to name because naming it felt like pushing, and she wasn't willing to push. But she let herself look back this time fully, without deflecting, because she'd decided somewhere in the middle of the last 2 hours that she was done being careful about every single thing. He held her gaze. "There's a thing I've been trying to say for about 3 weeks," he said. "I know," Hannah said. "You know what I've been trying to say. I have a fair idea." "Then why haven't you—" "Because it needed to come from you," she said. "On your own timeline. I wasn't going to pull it out of you." She looked at him steadily. "I'm still not, but I'll tell you that I'm not going anywhere. I'll tell you that whatever you're trying to say, you don't need to be afraid of it." She paused. "That's all the help I'm going to give you." Samuel Carter looked at her for a long moment with smoke in his hair and his bad wrist against his chest, and the wreckage of the Henderson warehouse behind him. And then he said, "I'd like you to stay. Not the arrangement we have. Something real. If that's—" He stopped. Tried again. "If that's something you'd want." "Yes," Hannah said. She didn't dress it up. "It's something I'd want." He exhaled. It was the exhale of a man who has been holding something for a long time and has finally been permitted to set it down. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They sat on the edge of the water trough in the gray morning and didn't need to say anything else. The twist that unwound everything came 2 hours later, and it came from Margaret. Hannah was helping Carla Fielding get her children settled at the Morley house, which had been opened up as temporary accommodation, when she heard raised voices from the direction of the main street. She knew Margaret's voice by now. She could pick it out of a crowd, and she knew the particular register of it that meant something had shifted. She excused herself and went to look. Margaret was standing in front of the post office with Hector Briggs and 2 other men, and she was not constructing a story. She was dismantling one. Her own. Hannah stopped at the edge of hearing and listened. "I was wrong about her," Margaret was saying. Her voice was clear and without the careful pleasantness that usually armored it. "I want to say that plainly. I was wrong, and I built a case out of my own fears, and some of you repeated things I said without knowing they came from me, and that wasn't fair to her or to those children." One of the men said something Hannah didn't catch. "I know what I said," Margaret said. "I know all of what I said. I'm not asking anyone to forget it. I'm asking you to weigh it against what you saw this morning." She paused. "I was in that bucket line because of her. She was the one who organized it. I want that on the record with Hector, who I understand is the closest thing this town has to a record." Hector Briggs, who was standing with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man watching something he'd been waiting to see, said, "Noted, Margaret." Hannah turned and walked away before Margaret could see her. She didn't need to watch it. The fact that it was happening was enough, more than enough. She understood something about Margaret Doyle that she hadn't fully understood before, that the woman's mistake had never been cruelty. Not really. It had been love misapplied. Love for a family she'd been standing watch over for a year, love that had calcified into possession in the absence of anything better to do with it. Margaret had been afraid of being replaced. She had been afraid of becoming unnecessary. And those were not small fears, Hannah knew. Those fears had lived in a version of them herself. Understanding it didn't erase the damage, but it changed the texture of the whole thing into something livable. The Sunday church meeting 3 days later was the kind Cutter's Creek would talk about for years. Hannah sat with the Carter children, all 5 of them in a row, with Ben wedged between her and Daisy and Noah on her other side, and Emily and Luke beyond him. Samuel sat at the end of the row. They filled the pew completely. It was the first time they had sat together in public as what they were becoming, and the whole town noticed, and the whole town was supposed to notice, and Hannah let them look. Reverend Coles gave a service about fire and about what communities do in the aftermath of something that burns. How you assess what was lost and what held, how you count what's still standing. It was not subtle. Hannah thought the Reverend was probably not a subtle man, which she found she appreciated. Afterward in the yard, people came to speak to Samuel, and they came to speak to Hannah, and they did it without the measuring quality that had been in every interaction for 2 months. Carla Fielding hugged her. Walt Reeves shook her hand with both of his. Old Mrs. Garrett, who Hannah had not previously met properly, and who turned out to be a woman of considerable opinion, told her that she'd heard about the mending and the biscuits and the wrist setting, and said, "You're a practical woman, Miss Brooks. I respect a practical woman," and moved on before Hannah could respond. Hector Briggs found her near the edge of the yard. "I'm going to say something to you," he said, "and you can take it or leave it." "All right," Hannah said. "Samuel's father was one of the finest men I ever knew. Stubborn, terrible at saying what he meant better with animals than people, and absolutely loyal to the people who earned it." He looked at her. "Samuel is all of those things. The earning it part." He tilted his head. "You've done that. He knows you've done that. Just making sure you know it too." Hannah held his gaze. "Thank you, Mr. Briggs." "Hector," he said, and walked away. The last part happened on a Tuesday quietly without audience. Samuel found her in the kitchen after supper, after the children were up, and the house had settled into its nighttime sounds. He set something on the table in front of her. She looked at it. It was a photograph. A formal portrait woman and man taken in a studio, the kind of photograph that costs something. The woman was Clara Carter, beautiful and straight-backed, and looking at the camera with the clear-eyed confidence of someone who knows exactly who she is. Hannah looked at it for a moment. "I wanted you to know her," Samuel said. "I've been thinking about it since you said Thomas would have liked me, a short breath, which meant you were talking about him like a person, and I realized I'd been keeping Clara like a wound instead of a person." He looked at the photograph. "She was funny, drier than you'd expect, made better pie than I will ever admit to you directly." He paused. "She would have had your measure inside of an hour and liked you for making her work for it." Hannah looked at the photograph for a long time. "She raised good children," Hannah said finally. "Yes," Samuel said. "She did. I'm not going to undo that. I'm going to build on it." She looked up at him. "That's all I can promise? That it'll be real, and it'll be built on what she already built." He reached across the table and took her hand. Just that, took her hand and held it, and the gesture had the quality of something that had been decided rather than something impulsive, something he'd thought through and chosen, which was exactly the kind of man he was. They sat like that for a while. 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday morning that was already threatening to be the hottest day of the summer, Emily came to the kitchen at 6 in the morning and started helping with breakfast without being asked. She moved around Hannah with the ease of someone who has learned the territory and made peace with it, handing her things she needed before she asked, knowing where everything was. At some point, without looking up from the pan she was tending, Emily said, "I was thinking about the harvest social in September." Hannah said. "Mrs. Morley asked me if we were coming as a family this year." She paused. I told her yes. Hannah kept her hands moving. She didn't look up. She did not react in the way she wanted to react, because reacting in the way she wanted to react would have made it into something Emily wasn't ready to make it. And Emily had come such a long way on her own terms, and deserved to keep moving on her own terms. "That sounds right," Hannah said. Emily nodded. She turned her pan. That was all. It was everything. On the last Saturday of August, Ben woke early and came to the kitchen while Hannah was building the fire, and he climbed into the chair nearest to her and looked at her with the serious brown eyes that were Clara's eyes, and Noah's eyes, and this family's particular eyes. And he said, "My Hannah, can we have corn cake today?" "We have the right cornmeal today," she said. So yes. So yes. He smiled the wide and uncomplicated smile of a 4-year-old who has gotten the answer he wanted, and he said, "I'm gonna go tell Luke." He ran out of the kitchen, calling Luke's name, and his small voice echoed up the stairs. And she heard Luke groan from behind his door, in the particular register of an older brother being woken on the one morning he wanted to sleep, and then she heard Luke say, all right, tell her I want extra butter." And Hannah stood in the kitchen of the Carter Ranch with the fire building beneath her hands, and the morning coming in around her, and 5 children waking above her, and the man down the hall, who had built 4 fences, and couldn't say what he meant, and was learning. And she thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach with a carpet bag and a letter, and a kind of hope she hadn't let herself name. She had come to this place looking for a door that would open. She had not found a door. She had found a home, not the kind that was handed to her, not the kind she'd been born into, but the kind that is built board by board through the hardest kind of days, through cold creek water and sick children, and long silences and small feathers left on windowsills and meals eaten together, and fences fixed at the edge of evening. The kind you earn. The kind that is yours precisely because it cost you something real. Hannah Brooks had paid in full, and the home she had built out of hard work and clear eyes and a stubbornness that would not bend was hers in the only way that ever truly mattered. Not because someone gave it to her, because she had refused every single day to leave.